Good Sunday morning, good people. We are here to discuss free trade and protectionism. But since we are celebrating Mother's Day in Estonia today, so I think we should start with a big round of applause to all the mothers, especially the ones who made it here. My name is Kristjan Lepik. I come from a company that is founded in Estonia but works on the global markets technology sector called Teleport, which was acquired 2 months ago by another global company, MooGuides. So I'm representing private sector and the views here. But we have a splendid panel also here, kind of in addition to splendid me. So let's start with introducing the panel first. Firstly, Mr. Mauro Petriccione, from Deputy Director General of the Directorate General for Trade. Oh, that's pretty long for introduction, but from European Commission. Then we have Marietje Schaake from Netherlands, member of the European Parliament. Biegun, Vice President of Ford. And Mr. Siim Kallas, who works now for University of Tartu, but was previously Prime Minister of Estonia and President of European Commission. So, an applause, please, for all of them. And what we will be discussing today is the changing global world right now, and especially in terms of economic side and free trade. So, we discussed with the panel members before we started that let's keep it really up to the pace, the presentation, and no longer than 2-minute, 3-minute single kind of remarks. And all the questions from the audience are welcome. So if you have one, please raise your hand and we can ask the panel. But let's just start with a short introduction round, and everybody can say their initial thoughts, and then we go to the questions. So, Mauro, can you please start?
Thank you. But first, apologies for my title. Bureaucrats be bureaucrats, and their titles are bureaucratic. Can't help that. Look, the question of the title of this panel is, it's a very good one. I think it's fundamentally true, but you have to spell out its implications if you want to really understand it. I mean, the assumption is you have free trade, you have no protectionism, you have more economic growth, you have fewer problems, and a safer, more secure society. I believe that all that is true, but that we will not do anything serious about it if we don't understand what's behind. Now, I had prepared a fantastic presentation, in typical Latin style, from the premise to the conclusion. I've ditched that. I'll just give you my conclusion straight away. First, economic growth alone today will not fix our problems. The key question, certainly in European society, perhaps elsewhere as well, is distribution of that growth, is equality or inequality. As long as we had enough economic growth, we could hide that. And you can still hide that in a number of countries. If you go to East Asia, the moment you see still a buzz and enthusiasm because people feel that tomorrow will be better and their children will live in a better world than they did. In Europe, you no longer have that. People hearken towards stability. They don't really think the future will be better. So the distribution of whatever growth we have is fundamental to the issue. Second point, if you look at free trade and growth from a narrower, more technical point of view, if you like, from a policy point of view, the equation is true. You have more growth if you have free trade, but it's not true that you don't have economic growth if you do not have free trade. And pretending otherwise, it's a losing proposition from a policy and a political point of view. We have to make a case why free trade gives you more growth, better growth, and in particular why trade policy, free trade agreements, for instance, give you a better distribution of growth. My third point is that, yes, protection from this point of view is a danger. I don't see that, however, as an existential threat. Even the rhetoric of President Trump And there I agree very much with what Stephen was saying yesterday. In trade policy, look for facts, not for statements. And so far, we haven't seen a lot of protectionist action from the US government under President Trump. But even that is something that the system can survive. In my view, there are two existential threats to the contribution that free trade can give to economic growth and job creation. One does come from President Trump, but it's more about his statements on multilateral trade institutions. Global trade rules cannot be done and undone in the political space of a presidency. And what he's saying about the WTO, the dispute settlement, the appellate body, the G20, is objectively dangerous, and their words hurt almost as much as facts. The second danger is in Europe, and it comes from the first point. It comes in Europe, you do have a minority of people who are anti-trade because they're also anti-globalization, they're fundamentally anti-Europe. But that remains a minority. In that minority, you also have a streak of anti-Americanism. But there is a lot more people who are listening because they feel left behind. Because they feel that our policy, which is free trade is good for you, and in any event, we make sure that trade agreements do no harm to our way of living, is not good enough. I think we are not making the case for why free trade agreements, free trade in general, are positively a contribution to their welfare and their well-being. And if we don't make that case, this minority, still a minority, will grow, and we've seen what happens when it threatens to become a majority like last year.
Okay, thank you. Mariette?
Thank you very much. I wanted to start by thanking the Estonian president and basically everyone who has contributed to this wonderful forum for including me. It's the first time I've been here, but it's always a pleasure to be in Estonia. I think it's incredible how a small country can punch above its weight, especially in acknowledging the strength of digitization, dealing with the challenges, standing for the open internet, but also for the open society. I think it's a great example. But now on the open economy and the way in which trade has been politicized more and more over the past couple of years. We see it in many examples, the discussions and demonstrations around TTIP and CETA, the transatlantic agreements that the EU was negotiating, but also the Ukraine Association Agreement, and even Brexit, I think, is a product of this confrontation and challenge of dealing with trade rules, under what scale, what context, and how to deal with globalization. There are many examples that we probably think of first where a strong and well-organized opposition, albeit often minorities, have had a dramatic impact on the discussion. And fewer, whether it's the private sector or politicians or even civil society and citizens, standing for the core of open societies and a rules-based multilateral system, even though it has brought us so much. And of course, the most dramatic shift, even though there are a lot of things to be seen, but still in the step away by this new administration from a long time US tradition of not only standing for free trade, but advocating it, and together with the European Union building a multilateral system that seeks to have equal rules globally. So I'm not quite of the school that I think we should be mild about what the President of the United States says. I think words have meaning, especially of the person in highest office in the most powerful country in the world. Having said that, there's a silver lining for me about the fact that TTIP is in a freezer for the moment. It has saved a lot of time, and it allows us, I think, to reorganize a bit in the European Union. It has also changed, I believe, the perspective by some of the most vehement opponents. Kind of surprised them perhaps that it was Donald Trump who was executing the agenda that they were standing in the streets for. Not necessarily their dreamed ally, I would imagine. But I've also seen in this discussion that there's a huge difference between what is going on in the more technical discussions that in the European Commission are going on, or that we are dealing with in the European Parliament, and the discussions that are happening in town halls, political discussions in cafes, or having been the recipient of many petitions, signatures, emails against trade, I can tell you these are often worlds apart between the technical, rational, the more emotional, and direct discussion about what is going on with the future of people's children and the impact of globalization. And I think this more technical world and the world of town halls need to come closer together if we want to properly address the challenges ahead. First of all, I think we need to take the concerns people have seriously and try to address them. I think we must also acknowledge that there has been selective protest, a lot of protest against the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, a lot of focus on the Ukraine Association Agreement, for example, I say with a bit of personal experience being Dutch, but nearly no attention. In my case, 0 emails, 0 questions, 0 tweets, 0 invitations to talk about it except in specialized expert groups about the EU-Japan negotiations, just to give an example of far advanced negotiations between the European Union and a very, very significant economy. There's also an irony because a lot of the opponents of the TTIP and CETA were constantly claiming that, you know, big business is lobbying the politicians and the poor NGOs cannot keep up with the big bucks of the private sector. And frankly, I think we've seen the opposite. I think we've seen an increasing reluctance of the private sector to engage in this discussion, and the same goes for the member states of the European Union, that on the one hand give a mandate, on the other hand don't stand for the task that they give the European Commission and don't engage their sectors, their provinces and their populations properly. So in this changing landscape, the paradox is, I guess, that the EU has a great opportunity but also responsibility at this moment in time, with the US, I believe, taking a step back, China taking a big step forward with its own ambitions, and a real need to protect and advance the multilateral system, to develop rules-based trade as a frame around globalization that takes off the sharpest edges. In order to get there, of course, we need to have a more transparent and much more honest discussion about what the pros and the cons are, what we can realistically achieve, give context about how and who can achieve some of the necessary steps. This should include the context that technology and innovation cost more jobs than globalization. It should be much more clear in the discussion and in the way in which we organize this process that at the national level in the EU, most of the mitigating measures can be taken, whether it is reschooling people, whether it is compensating sectors when they face losses. But it should also be very clear what mandate the European Commission and the negotiators are being given by the EU member states. I think we can, and this is in conclusion, and must advance and develop a positive agenda for a rules-based system, rules-based trade that allows us to be rule makers and not rule takers, but that also engages people in being co-owners of the solutions, of the challenges that only together we can face. That includes SMEs and not just big corporations in benefiting from global market access where most of the growth is going to take place. We should also look at how, with a rules-based trade system, we can tackle new problems, help advance the trade in green goods, ecologically friendly goods, or deal with the challenges of rules for digital trade. I believe we have a lot to build on, a lot of success. We recently voted for the Canada-EU trade agreement. I think it was a very important statement at a very important moment. But there's also very different areas where we can build on success, where we use rules around trade to stop trading conflict minerals or in goods that are used for torture and the death penalty. These kinds of rules show that there's very different things you can accomplish, but for all of them, you need to have a rules-based system. Lastly, I believe one of the key challenges has been that the European Commission, although I broadly support their Trade for All agenda, where values are an integral part of our trade agenda, have not had enough resources to engage people properly. The demand for engagement is huge, the budgets are minimal, And we need to look much more at the importance of this kind of citizen and stakeholder engagement, as well as communications, if we want to be on an equal footing with some of the other players that are dominating this debate, and then setting the frame to which in the EU then we can only respond, instead of having a proactive approach of engaging people in this very, very important but very politicized debate.
Okay, thank you. Stefan, you're next.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel with people from different walks of life that work quite diligently on the same issues that we do in the private sector. In the course of this presidential campaign in the United States, there was probably no issue that more confounded the business community in the United States than our president's positions on trade. And at the same time, there was probably no issue that resonated better with voters than our president's position on trade. There's a lot of trepidation in the business community among our trading partners, others around the world, about what direction this trade policy will take. And as Mauro pointed out, so far it's still a work in progress. Not much has happened. But when you think about the agenda and the pretty hard positions that have been laid out on a broad agenda, there's a lot of work ahead. So the president has challenged NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement the United States withdrew from. We have TTIP still pending. The president's talked a lot about China's currency policies, currency manipulation. We have Section 232 investigations under U.S. trade law going on, testing the national security implications of unfair trading practices in steel and aluminum, and so on and so on. We have numerous trade issues and potential trade disputes that have potential to open up. And I'm happy to, in the Q&A, if anybody has specific questions, to share more perspective on those. Trans-Pacific Partnership has certainly gotten a lot of attention. The president did withdraw officially from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But as I said yesterday, and I would reiterate it again today, TPP did not die on November 8th. TPP was dead on arrival. That agreement started with a very sound premise that the United States would work with a handful, 5 countries initially in the Asia-Pacific region, who supported a very high level of ambition in free trade negotiations. We would achieve a common approach in a trade agreement, and then that itself would become a critical mass for other countries to begin to dock on to aspire to those same high ambitions, and slowly build out from a strong center a commitment to high ambition free trade in the Asia-Pacific region. And in its beginning, it was very much the case. But over time, it became something different. It became a geopolitical exercise. The foxes and the sheep, the wolves and the sheep, began to be invited into the same negotiation, and the ambitions began to change dramatically. In time, TPP ended up as an association of 12 countries, some which strongly and consciously support free trade, and some which are simply mercantilist powers that are only looking to game out the international trading system to sustain their systems for another generation. And in the process, private sector support began to fall off. When TPP was finally negotiated and signed, it had the least support of any free trade agreement from the private sector since free trade agreements began in the United States. In fact, it was several months before the business community even released a tepid statement of support for the agreement in the United States. And in several sectors of industry, including in agricultural goods, including in companies that move data around the world, and pharmaceutical companies, it received overwhelming opposition. And so that trade agreement didn't die when Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. It was not going to pass in its current form in the United States. TTIP is, I want to start with a couple comments on TTIP to say that I'm going to take back what I said yesterday, that TTIP, the challenges from TTIP were in Europe and not the United States. It's too much of a blanket statement. At a governmental level, the problem with TTIP was the United States. The United States was inflexible in its negotiations, and U.S. negotiators failed to, and U.S. political leaders failed to enforce political will upon the parts of the government that needed to be forthcoming, particularly on coordinating standards and harmonizing standards between the United States and Europe. At a societal level, the opposition was much more here in Europe. And it's not that we shouldn't expect at some point some reaction in the United States, but frankly, the United States wasn't focused, the US society wasn't focused on TTIP the way European society was. The premise for TTIP is also still quite durable. And first of all, just the economic benefit of removing regulations and tariffs on the volume of trade that passed between US and Europe has an economic argument in and of itself that's quite compelling and would benefit both societies. But more so than that, getting the trade agreement right would also bring together the transatlantic community in a way that's very important to sustaining the values of the transatlantic community. And here I'll use this last example, my industry, the automobile industry. So in Europe this year, in the European Union, your customers will buy approximately 16 million new cars. And in the United States this year, our customers will buy about 17 million new cars. And in China this year, the customers will buy about 28 million new cars. And so when a company like ours begins to design its business and figure out where its center of gravity is and who's going to call the tune for our industry, what regulations, what economic rules, we go to where the scale is. It's a decision to go where the customer is. And so with 28 million units of sales on an annual basis, China has an enormous weight in the global marketplace. But if the United States and Europe could combine their markets, it would be 33 million. It would be the largest market in the world, and underpinning that market are all the economic and even democratic values that US and Europe stand for. Limited role of government, respect for private property, respect for intellectual property, transparency, compliance, non-corruption. The values of our two systems underpin the economies of our two systems, and it's very important that we put these together with a successful TTIP agreement. Ben Franklin had a famous quote in the United States, and might be known to some of you. Either we hang together or we hang separately. And that's what TTIP is all about.
Thank you, Stefan. Siim, you're next.
Yeah, thank you very much. I suppose that we don't have any need to convince panelists and distinguished audience that protectionism is bad for economic growth. But of course, in political circles, protectionism has become really very popular. And that's worrying. Of course, this is a widespread political concept which has been used in the United States various hundreds of years ago, and in UK, and in Europe. And during my being as European Commissioner, we numerous times we discussed, and in very sensitive manner, the protectionist measures. For instance, there was a lingerie war, there was a question of solar panels, there was steel products, and always there was a strong attempt to create the protectionist barriers. But of course, in these concrete cases, protectionist barriers were not created. But what worries me today is that the role of small countries, and if really the protectionism as a concept in global trade will become more and more popular and more used by big countries, then of course the losers will be small countries, because small countries don't have adequate reply or adequate countermeasures. And this is all in for instance, when Doha round collapsed, then in Commission then people who were responsible for these Doha negotiations, they said that now it's time of global agreements. Global framework is over. We must now go to bilateral agreements. But bilateral agreements is a poisonous thing in this regard. And especially again concerning the smaller countries, even the members of European Union inside, we have much less access to these negotiations, to the outcome, to the details, but also of course outside. And this protectionism, this is today where we cannot have really in political circles what exactly to say. In Estonia, 25 years ago, when we started from zero to create our wonderful republic you enjoy today, we all enjoy today, we actually in economic policy started from real zero. We didn't introduce any kind of trade restrictions, foreign trade restrictions, no custom tariffs. This created a lot of problems for us in negotiations with WTO and European Union because they asked that you must have some custom tariffs. How could we negotiate a possible compromise? What will be the common level if you don't have at all anything? But this was simply, and what was the consequence? For us, the consequence was a very good inflow of foreign direct investments because this protectionism in trade is very much linked in investment policies and free movement of capital, and then we also didn't have any restriction in capital movement, and this brought to us a lot of foreign direct investments, which then helped us to create a very rapid economic growth. So, and today's the question is for me as I can consider myself as economist, but even more as politician. It's a question that economists can provide a lot of good arguments what might be the really politically convincing and attractive response. And the danger is that protectionism is attractive and seductive concerning short-term policies. Elections coming. Ford is closing factory in Belgium. Politicians say, we will introduce some measures, okay, we subsidize, we protect our jobs, not, of course, concerning at all what will happen next. And this, I think that this is a very big political challenge to also to combine now all advantages provided by globalization of trade and free movement of capital, people, and goods, and to introduce this concept or to actually reintroduce this concept in political life. Thank you.
Thank you all good panelists, and I think now it's the time for questions. But I will start with a remark. I will ask some questions first, then come back to you. A French economist, Frédéric Bastiat, said almost 200 years ago that in economy there are two types of kind of analysis to be done. First is to kind of research the scene, what you see in economy right now, and those are what things that are in the news. And then is the unseen, the kind of underlying forces that you don't see, but can kind of change our future a lot. So my question to the panelists would be now, let's not discuss the kind of the trade agreements, at least for this question, because this is already, I think, the effect of a cause of that is something else, that they are stalling the trade agreements, and why politicians maybe are sometimes reluctant to act on those. So what are those kind of, in the society, the underlying forces, what you think are the most important ones, the problems that drive us or the governments towards the protectionism? Not an easy question, but...
No, okay, who?
Go ahead, no, please.
Yeah.
No, I think it's, the most visible is the driving force. This is of course the question of employment and organizations who are dealing with the interests of employees. That's always a loss of jobs, and this is you must answer to them. That's always a challenge to explain that really what can be told to these people. Then it's of course a very large variety of different organizations who are concerned about environment and food safety and all these type of things. And again, you must and Europe in this particular regard, I think Europe has been quite successful, and afterwards it's now clear that the quality of European goods is also a trademark and very much highly appreciated in all around the world. But what I would like to say is simply concerning this TTIP issue, and one thing is also what is necessary is how to say, the commitment and courage of leadership. For instance, the TTIP, and it's mentioned in introduction remarks as well, the Wallonian government who stopped, almost stopped the Canadian agreement, and how could it happen? But it was, what was in certain extent, it was a mistake, because this is exclusive competence of the European Union. And that's not, it's not assumed that this will be also ratified. It will be also discussed and go to the regional governments, and then their opinion will be. There is a negotiation mandate. Governments give a mandate. You go to negotiate, and then afterwards European Parliament and Council ratify this agreement. So in some particular fields, I would say, it's simply if we use the possibilities which are in the law and in the treaty, then it's probably in some moments there should not be hesitation to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. We want to the next.
Two things. I mean, first, I don't agree with your premise that agreements are stalled. I'm happy
I'm installing in a way.
I'm happy to come back to that, but I should simply point out that the only European agreement which is actually stalled is TTIP, and comfortable as we may be with the stall for the time being, because a pause for thought, as Marietje was pointing out, is useful, we did not stall it. And everything else we're doing is going on. But I'm happy to come back to that later. But the point on, I like the point you made on what's seen and what's not seen. What disturbs me in the debate, protectionism versus free trade, is that both notions are profoundly false. Before right or wrong, they're false. Free trade is not even a caricature, because a caricature is a distorted version of something that exists. Free trade, you know, as in the Wild West, without rules, has never existed, doesn't exist, never will exist. We are talking about what rules do you want for trade, how fair those rules are, how democratic those rules are, who decides them, and who applies them. But you know, free trade in itself is a misleading notion. Protection is even worse, because protection is good for us, protection is bad for us. The reality is protection is good for some. For whom is it good? Do we have a democratic debate on who benefits from protectionism or not? Protection is about, as Siim Kallas was reminding us, about protecting certain jobs, at the price of not creating others. Who's making that choice? Are we making that choice by putting forward keeping a factory open and the jobs of certain people continuing, at least for a while, which is a perfectly legitimate objective, towards the possibility of creating more jobs, youth employment, etc.? We're not having that debate. From time to time, somebody reminds us of that, and then the issue goes quiet, and we go back to protection, good or bad. We'll never get out of it this way. So the unseen, as you were reminding us, is much more important than the seen.
Okay, thank you. Mariette?
I think a lot of people are experiencing the concern that the next generation will not automatically be better off than their own. And that's for the first time since the Second World War in Europe, that is actually a potential. And so we have, I think, come to expect that the sky was the limit and that growth would be endless. Combine that with a lot of rapid changes, technological change, scale change, terrorism, environmental concerns, etc. And I think there's uncertainty about where protection will come from. And as a result, we see identity politics, nostalgia for the past, and a retracting into smaller scale communities. And I think the essential question and also perspective that we have to address is where this protection is going to come from. Because it also relates to whether trade or rules or multilateralism should be organized on the European level or on the local level. And I believe that a strong rules-based system that guides globalization that guides trade, make sure it's adhering to high standards, make sure that the benefits of trade in foreign markets are distributed in an even way. And this would include addressing some of the excesses in the private sector which have really eroded trust among people and which have made it seem as if politicians are acting in the interest of these big corporations and not in the interest of people. So I think these are some of the underlying trends that are leading to the fallout in this debate. And it is a task for us, politicians, to regain that trust by showing that actually the biggest discrepancies, the concerns for the future can be dealt with if we work together effectively and if we strengthen a rules-based system that's based on high standards instead of embracing a race to the bottom.
Thank you. Stefan?
In addition to agreeing with everything that's been said here, I would just say two last things. One is, well, just really one. There's definitely a deeply held negative impression in large swaths of American society about the consequences of free trade negotiations. I come from the city of Detroit in the industrial Midwest. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio delivered the presidency to President Trump because of that antagonism, because of the degree to which his trade positions resonated. Ironically or surprisingly, I don't think the answer is better free trade negotiations. I think the answer is economic policies that deliver better prosperity and income growth for our societies. Mm-hmm. And if we can do that, I think we lessen the reaction to trade agreements. I think trade agreements are an essential tool to delivering that prosperity and income growth over time. But absent those, I think you lose the public support for free trade negotiations. You make it very easy even to blame trade for the consequences of other policies that fail to deliver those outcomes.
Yeah, very good points, because in a way those discussion was driven towards the point I wanted to, because the trade agreements is that effect that is caused by the underlying problems in the economies, especially the jobs that Siim mentioned, and also maybe the divide. That is also the reason for Brexit and why Trump got elected, and the divide, whether it's between a city or a country or education-based. But that are maybe the problems that we need to work before we can solve this. Siim?
No, I just want to totally agree with what Stephen said. In the United States, it's here is this belt which voted for President Trump or candidate. It's but it's I think it's for political message. What seems to me is a weak part for us who are devoted advocates of free trade and globalization. It's that there is somewhere is a barrier. So everybody, there is a free trade agreement concerning the same automobile car manufacturing in the United States, and everybody we are defending and saying that this is not bad, that it's free trade will provide more jobs, but actually how? And how to then convince society to show very clearly, like Mauro said, that yes, if we protect an obsolete industry or obsolete enterprise, then it means that no other new jobs can be created. But how to show, how to convince society that look, this free trade is bringing benefits, also creating a new opportunities. And this is sometimes it's a difficult task. It's if you only speak very schematically, use wonderful economists in history who have all promoted and said how good is free trade. And at the same time, people think that okay, you are talking, but the same car manufacturing, these Japanese are coming and take our jobs, and in everywhere it's most remarkable case was when President Sarkozy was extremely angry about the production of Dacia cars in Romania, which have been produced by Renault, in fact. But he wanted before Romania joined European Union, this was some kind of understanding that they don't export their cars to France. But of course, after accession, European enlargement of the European Union, Dacia cars are everywhere. And then I remember some outburst of President Sarkozy, who said that how this could happen, that now we created jobs in Romania, we are losing jobs in France as a consequence.
Okay. Thank you. I remembered an interesting tidbit of information. Recently there was a leadership change. In global bond markets, there is now the world's biggest bond fund is owned by somebody. Does anybody know who is now the world's biggest bond fund owner? It's a company, private one, which is making those fine products, Apple. So Apple has that much cash right now that it's over with $200 billion. So they are the world's biggest bond fund owner, owning that much bonds just to invest somewhere. And in a way, I think that shows the kind of change in the society. This couldn't be done 20 or 10 years ago because no company would be that big. But now the world is changing in that sense. And maybe also like what we discussed here, I think the concept of time to me seems very different in the private and public sector, which are kind of remarks is stalling. 3 months stalling for us would be a disaster as a private company. But maybe my question would be to you all, considering, for example, our company has offices in 4 cities globally, San Francisco, London, Hong Kong, and now Tallinn. Not the biggest city probably in Europe, but happened that way. So when thinking about hiring next 50 persons, since we are doing digital business, we don't care that much about all the regulations. We do care about the regulations, but still we decide based on the data, the cost, where they will be. They could be in Hong Kong, could be in Tallinn. So I think the world is changing that much in that sense as well. So maybe we should take a different approach to the kind of considering the agreements that are being discussed, also considering how fast the private sector can move and maybe reinforce that. I know it's maybe a kind of a bit out of the box thinking, but what are your thoughts on this?
So what I think we should focus on is on the principles and the goals that we have. So for example, fair competition, how do you make sure there's no unfair competition or trust forming, and how do you regulate that? How do we make sure in Europe that we remove unnecessary barriers in a digital single market, for example, so that we aspire to educate that kind of talent that you might need with a company that's growing, and that there's no unnecessary barriers for you to hire someone from, let's say, Greece, instead of someone from Hong Kong or something. So I believe our task is to adapt the policies to the changing world in order to stick to the very principles of our open society, open economy. And indeed, the pace with which technology advances, companies can seek the lowest resistance point globally with big teams of lawyers, do make it a challenge for us to keep up with democratic decision making. I mean, if I only zoom in on the technological revolution, we are always going to be reacting with policy, and even more so in light of the very rapid changes in technology. But bringing it back to trade, if we believe that there are principles like the right to privacy or freedom of expression or non-discrimination or fair competition in the digital economy, we will also have to look at rules that go along with these global trends, that actually frame the business in some reasonable standard-based way, which I think is what is our task, our history, and our future in Europe to do. Not to over-regulate, but to regulate there where we have to maintain principles even in a rapidly changing world.
What you said is extremely relevant. It's not, I don't think it's out of the box. It's core. And it goes to the heart of why your company has chosen to put Estonia in the same box as California. What we should do with our trade agreements, with our trade policy measures, is essentially 2 things. We should encourage a better business environment. Better business environment doesn't mean subsidies or being friendly to business. It means transparency. It means no corruption. It means non-discrimination. It means clear timetables for dealing with the public administration. It means very practical things. That's how you attract people. And it also means concentrating on the technological change that we want to achieve. And that's the point that Marietje was making is essential. We have talked about the digital single market. We talked about encouraging digital trade in our trade agreement. But unfortunately, we are not in a position to do that rationally. We're not spending our time and energy on that because we have a much more fundamental challenge, which is the legitimacy of what we're doing. And if we don't solve that challenge, we won't be able to concentrate on the practical challenge, which is the one you and other business people are asking us to do. But at the end, the two are linked. Again, the question of data is fundamental. We are not going to be able to create an international framework of rules which is facilitating digital trade if we don't address the relationship with data privacy. And at the moment, we're addressing it in terms of contradiction. And as long as we do that, we won't solve it. I wish I had a recipe in my pocket. I'm negotiating with a number of countries where data is crucial, it's fundamental. I don't have a solution today. I don't even have a position for that matter. But if we don't manage to find a way to both the question of the usefulness of what we're doing and its legitimacy, I think we're asking for trouble. That for me is the existential threat to trade policy and the contribution of trade to economic growth that we have now.
Okay, thank you. Stefan?
I'd like to live in the world that Mariette described, but we live in a different world. We've closed plants. We've dealt with, my company has dealt with the implications of even good trade policies that shift competitive pressures and shift the incentives for companies to invest in different places and produce in different places. Several years ago, we went through a very challenging plant closure in Belgium. We closed a plant in Genk. It's well known that the European car industry has an extraordinary excess in capacity. That excess in capacity is a consequence of companies' optimism to conquer a larger part of the market. It has a significant incentive in the form of state aid coming from European governments to incentivize even uncompetitive manufacturing in the marketplace. And it comes from a fundamental political mindset that jobs are a finite commodity in an economy. And I find that view no more strongly held actually than here in Europe. That a job is national patrimony. A job is like coal in the ground. There's a finite amount of it and it's yours. And what's missing is the understanding that jobs are not actually a commodity. They're a consequence of a good economy. Jobs actually are a renewable resource. They grow, they expand, they multiply when the conditions are there to be able to grow the economy and produce them. You know, it is a very unpleasant business to have to close a plant. And there is a huge human consequence for thousands of people in attending, supporting industries in the economy to lose their positions. It is also prohibitively expensive. The only reason somebody will close a plant in Europe today is because the cost of keeping it open exceeds the cost of closing it. And that has to be a really, really bad loss to get you to that point, because you can lose billions in a plant closure in Europe in order to deal with all the layers of European law, of national law, of the legal negotiations that happen. And I'm not saying that there's not an appropriate place for regulation and a humane approach to dealing with the private sector, but I am waiting for the politician that will show up on the day that we make this announcement and lay out a well-founded case for doing it so and saying, oh, that makes a lot of sense. I'm sure in time this will produce more economic growth and more renewable investment in our economy to create jobs. It's far, far from that. And that actually, you know, for those of you who are involved in politics, is a deterrent to investment to begin with. You have to calculate the cost of getting out when you're calculating the cost of going in.
Marietje, you wanted to add
I
something?
just wanted to briefly respond because I think we have to be very careful for caricatures back and forth. We have a different system in Europe. I think many different member states have different systems still. And of course, jobs are a consequence of economic activity. But this idea that in Europe we're constantly over-regulating and thereby being difficult to attracting business, I think is simplified. And I'm also interested in general to see then how, for example, this new American administration wants to bring back manufacturing jobs to the United States and be competitive at the same time. I think the challenge for us is to make sure that our social welfare systems are both reformed and remain sustainable. That is a huge challenge that some countries like my own have taken important steps in, but countries like France, for example, still have an extraordinary task ahead to do. So I understand your suggestion that some of the rules are outdated, or at least that's what I could understand from what you're saying, and that they're not always inviting or helping global changes and reflected in the rules. But this sort of platitude that the EU is constantly over-regulating, I hear it a lot in Silicon Valley. I actually think that proper regulation has a place in open markets. And it's very, very important, especially if we're trying to look at the excesses of economic development, uneven distribution, globalization, etc. So I think there's a place for regulation, but I'm a classical liberal, so I would never embrace it as a goal in and of itself. But let's be careful for caricatures.
Stefan?
I agree with Mariette's critique, but those weren't the points I wanted to make either. On the overregulation, I agree with you. I think that's a caricature, and I'm totally with you. And I didn't mean to present Europe as the counter to the outstanding example of the United States either, because that's, in fact,
that's a bit of a relief.
In fact, if one did take at face value the rhetoric as we've heard it, we're going to look a lot more like Russia in China than Europe before long. But I'm confident that we won't get to that point. I think what I would really go back to is my comment a couple of questions ago, which is that I think the answer here is to produce durable economic growth and raise growing wages for our societies, because these kind of inefficiencies, a strong and positive economy actually will squeeze inefficiencies out while it's producing those opportunities. The conundrum we find ourselves in is when we're just getting the stick and not getting the carrot. I think we need more carrot.
Okay. I have one more question to you, Stefan. Just related to the car industry, and I remember the joke which said that Tesla is pretty much an iPad that is drivable. So it's so much technology and so little car-related stuff, but which is not true, but kind of we're getting to the point when last year when I was in Berlin, I discussed with a really great data scientist from Ford and the kind of efforts and money that you put there also in the digital side of the car industry. You kind of tend to think about Ford like in terms of plants and the kind of making the cars, but the digital side is also becoming so important. So would you say that this industry is changing as a whole could be an example how the digital world is going everywhere?
Yeah. So I'm not here to pitch my company, but so I'll talk about it in broader industry trends. But some interesting things about the car industry. The car industry purchases more semiconductors than the IT industry. The automobile industry globally invests more in R&D than the aircraft industry or the pharmaceutical industry. It's the top investor in R&D. It is probably the highest technology industry in the global economy today, but because it's anchored around a mode of transportation that's over a century old, we tend to think of it more in terms of the internal combustion engine or the CO2 outputs, not the technology. Our industry is going through an enormous transformation right now. Not only is it a highly competitive industry across the global marketplace, but we're seeing a transformation inside even more traditional forms of mobility and how the powertrain works, hybrid electric, battery electric, fuel cell. All these areas of technology are being rapidly developed and pursued by various manufacturers around the world. A second trend that's impacting the industry is that you have a rise of new competitors. Mobility is becoming a bigger part of the revenue stream than the actual vehicles themselves. Companies like Uber, companies like Waze, and others I'm sure that you have here in any numbers in Europe as well. And the car companies and the tech companies are all plunging into this full force as well, because there's a huge amount of revenue, huge amount of profit involved in just the mobility, the movement of people leaving aside the cars. And the third trend, which is the one that's not as distant in the future is it may seem, is fully autonomous vehicles. And we have fully autonomous aircraft, we have fully autonomous rail transport. Fully autonomous vehicles are well within reach. The technology is already here. The ability to use highly developed radars and data processing in order for a vehicle to be controlled and drive itself on the road in a manner that's more safe than any human driver is all been conquered. Integrating it into a system, delivering it to a customer, getting the customer comfortable with the fact that they're sitting in a vehicle that doesn't have a steering wheel, a brake, or a gas pedal, and then also, needless to say, shaping the regulatory environment so that it's meeting the standards of society as determined by the policymakers who shape regulation. All this is on the cusp of happening. I would say that within 5 years, we will not find it surprising to see driverless vehicles moving around on the roads of our cities. They may be delivery vehicles to start with. They may be urban taxi services. They may be city fleet vehicles. But there will be autonomous vehicles within the next 5 years on the roads. So this is an enormous transition. Inside the industry, the competition is also heated between different sectors, between the traditional automobile manufacturers and the tech industry. That battle is yet to be won. I would say the conceit in the automobile industry is anyone can write software, but it's really hard to build a car. And the conceit in the technology industry is anybody can build a car. It's really hard to write software. Partnerships will probably develop. There will be winners and losers in the process too. But that's all a great part of an innovative and dynamic economy. And by the way, there will be job consequences. Driverless vehicles displace drivers. Technology companies building cars globally sourced with parts comprised of a global supply chain are a very different employer than a large factory located on the edge of an urban area with a bunch of automobile suppliers around it providing thousands of jobs. So lots of consequences for this that policymakers are going to have to get their heads around besides the regulation.
Yep.
And in a way, 10 years ago, this industry seemed like so in place or so fixed, and now it's changing so much. So Siim, transportation is your old love from the European Commission. So what are your thoughts on this mixing together with trade policies and this kind of change in the system?
Yes, we have moved to transport and some other issues. I only wanted to say that having been responsible for transport policy in the European Union, then I was also, I would say, met by absolutely different arguments. Some people said that this is bad. Mobility of people as such is a bad thing. People should not travel so much. So industry, you should not create additional possibilities. And in Europe, you have created too open market for aviation, and people simply now can fly wherever, and this is not good. This is not good. So I simply listened. I am supporting, of course, these all innovations, but I think that there are different views as well. And concerning this regulation, and which is now, the regulation is definitely very much linked to trade issues. And again, I support, I share the view what Marietje said that this is a highly mythological talks about overregulation in the European Union. And I have asked numerous times, what kind of directive? Bring me a directive. I will propose to abolish this directive. And even if we have created something, these people came and said that, come on, are you crazy? This is not possible. But the positive side is that very many regulations concerns the quality of products and services and safety. And of course, nobody, and this means that abroad, big European producers have said that don't ever reduce the level of quality standards. This is our trademark. When or if a product is produced in Europe, it is greatly appreciated in various other markets. So, but that's difficult to, and this is a vast bulk of regulations are quality, safety, food safety, all these things.
Okay, great. I already have seen, I don't know, 7 questions from the audience, so I'll start with where I show the first hands. Lady in the second row.
Yes, sir. I'm Baiba Braj, Latvian ambassador to the United Kingdom, and my question is to Mauro about Brexit as a global process. Surprisingly, the word Brexit was not mentioned here yet, but it will come. So we have several processes going on together in the same time, including with Japan, was mentioned, a number of others. So if you could look a little bit at this kind of architecture, how it's going to happen when the trade agreement with Japan come together in the same time with Brexit negotiations. And plus, of course, we have internal processes in the UK where the trade has featured prominently as, you know, freeing from those ties of the EUs that are tying British hands in terms of trading globally with all the other wonderful countries.
Please.
Well, I'll spare you the official no comment. But if I knew how Brexit is going to pan out, I'll probably be so good at making predictions, I'll be out in the stock market making millions. The only thing I would say is that today, the European Union has its place in the global marketplace in terms of how integrated we are in global supply chains and in trade flows. By stepping out, the UK will have to find its place. It will have options. There will not be the same options as a member of the European Union. And there will be additional question of what will be the place of the UK in the European supply chains, in the European trade integration. I think the complexity of this is not yet emerging in the discussion. And when that complexity emerges, I think there will be some very difficult moment. I'm not being a catastrophist here. The world will go on for the UK as well, and there will be a different way, but it will be very different what it looks like. And frankly, you know, speculating at this stage is idle. I wouldn't know where it's going to end up.
Thank you. Stefan?
I'll give you a practical example of Mauro's point about the complexity. I work for a company that's has a historic investment in the United Kingdom. We build approximately 2 million automobile engines in the European Kingdom every year. We employ 10,000 plus people. The vast majority of those engines are traded within the European Union for assembly plants that are located across the European Union. When the UK leaves the EU, the consequences of a 10% tariff on those engines, if trade liberalization isn't sustained, is existential to the investments. It's very hard to see a formula under which the government can make that manufacturing competitive. But that's just the superficial. Then there's the subordinate. Turkey is not a member of the European Union, and if the UK reaches this agreement with the European Union, it still doesn't necessarily have it with Turkey, so now there has to be an agreement with Turkey. So that's another level of complexity, but that doesn't stop there. South Africa has a free trade agreement with the European Union in which European Union products sent to South Africa, provided they have a sufficient level of European content, are considered to be European products and get into South Africa duty-free and vice versa. But those engines will no longer constitute European content, so that they don't, the products made in Europe and in South Africa with European content no longer are able to be free trade products under the South African free trade agreement with Europe. So the layers of complexity are enormous. Absent a transitional arrangement, we see it as a virtual impossibility that there will be a solution to the level of complexity of these issues. I'm highly skeptical that Europe and the EU and the UK will be able to even negotiate the direct trade implications of Brexit in the timetable we have. But I am absolutely certain that they will not be able to negotiate them with Turkey and South Africa, and so there has to be a longer period of time at a minimum in order to be able to address the complexities that Mauro points out.
As a remark, I must say that the good panelists here have surely kind of intrigued the audience. I have never seen so many hands in the audience for questions, but I will take them in the order they were raised. So, gentlemen in the first row.
Thank you. Mark Fisher from G+. First of all, a compliment to the panel. I've actually rarely seen a defense of free trade done so competently. I was shocked when I came back. I lived abroad for a long time. When I came back to Germany, and last year there were 200,000 people protesting against TTIP in the one country that arguably benefits the most and has benefited the most from global trade more than any other country. I think to a certain extent there was also a failure of the political leadership basically to make the case for TTIP and to make it in a way, as Ms. Schaake has said, that really actually brought people along and made them understand that a lot of their current level of prosperity actually is built on these trade agreements that we've built through the GATT, through the WTO over the decades. That's number one. Number two, a specific question to Steve. So with the position, or basically the statements that we've heard from the new administration in the United States, specifically concerning NAFTA, and you said already that you're quite worried about it, and in Europe the same thing actually, industry is of course very worried about it. Specifically the United States, because of its size and because of its power in those it would have in those negotiations with Canada and with Mexico. Is there a chance that actually the US could, on the medium term, short to medium term, reap real benefits, and how dangerous would that be to the multilateral and to the global trade system? Just to set the precedent basically where the US administration says, okay, we're going to unravel NAFTA and we're going to renegotiate, and actually in the end it might happen that the US will be better off, certainly in the short or medium term. I think there's a real danger to that, but I have to say I don't understand enough about the details of it, whether that's realistic or not. Thank you.
So it's a long subject, and I'll try to stick to the very highest points. First of all, renegotiating NAFTA and withdrawing NAFTA from NAFTA are not necessarily the same thing. There's a broad consensus in the among economic policymakers in the United States, Canada, and Mexico that a 25-plus-year-old agreement certainly stands to benefit from a little bit of renegotiation and an updating, and that's the same in the European Union with the European Union's free trade agreement with Mexico. Ambitions change over time. In the case of Mexico, I think the ambitions will be higher than they were initially, but also industries have changed, e-commerce and intellectual property, a variety of things. There are many areas, and labor rights and environmental commitments too, which both have also been elevated globally and in the context of how the NAFTA free trade partners look at these issues. So there's a number of areas where you could make very important improvements, progress, update, that strengthen and enhance the agreement. But here's the rub. It's likely to actually benefit Mexico more than anyone else in the trading relationship. Mexico has the greatest gains to make in its economy. Mexico's actually a very well-run economy. It's got its challenges for sure in other areas, but and it actually has a very strong devotion to free trade. The problem with NAFTA is not the quality of the free trade. It's that there are certain economic realities that come about when economies of differing levels of development engage in a free trade agreement. I keep going back to the same solution. I think the temperature on NAFTA heats up when economic growth and prosperity in the United States are in decline. I don't think it's a consequence of Mexico. So we're going to engage in a renegotiation. I think that's for certain. It's not started yet. It's not even been officially notified. We came very close. I'm quite certain, confirmed by colleagues in the White House. The president came very close to withdrawing outright from NAFTA, which technically would have been a statement of intent to withdraw within 6 months, but would have been then effectively negotiating with a gun against the head. That would have been unfortunate. The president ultimately decided not to, because I think he was, by some very good advisors, was informed that the economic consequences for the U.S. economy would actually be quite traumatic. Our agricultural sector depends heavily upon consumers in Mexico, and the farmers in the farm belts of the flyover states, as they were referred to yesterday, are a core constituency for the president.
Yes.
And so cooler heads, good assessment of the data, and political interest all compelled the president to pull back. But we are going to have this negotiation, and my hope is that it's a constructive, positive negotiation that leads to an improved agreement and doesn't focus narrowly on the question of rebalancing trade.
Thank you. Gentleman in the second row.
Yes, Begos Polits, Latvian Parliament MP, and actually, thank you panelists for a very good discussion, and actually it could be also put in a nutshell by Schumpeterian idea of the creative destruction and question of education, and actually idea which came out from the Marietje's talk was when you mentioned that actually every generation thinks that the next one should live better, and I think this is a problem with the protectionism here. So don't you think that there are some political circles, not only in Europe but around the world, which misuse this term? Because if we think about that every generation should live better than others, it could be discussed on the educational terms, but if we think about consumerism, about the living standards, then how come better you can live as we live in Europe today? Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
I'll just do maybe a brief answer. I think what we see much more of is exploitation of fear. So the fear can be real. The question is, what do politicians put in an answer? And what I think we see a lot is that it's politically beneficial to stir that fear, to make it worse, to actually even feed the fear, instead of saying, we understand your concerns and this is what we're going to do. And that's, I think, where the watersheds between the populist parties, some of the newcomers on the political stage, and those who have persistently taken responsibility, have been trusted again by voters. It's a huge difference. And I think part of also what was said about NAFTA is interesting, is that it's not that difficult to make sweeping statements in a campaign. It's much more difficult to take responsibility for sweeping policies with uncertain outcomes. And you see Marine Le Pen in France, you know, strong words about leaving the EU and the euro, and then the closer she got to having to own the promise, the more she stepped away from it. And so I think we need to all be a part of a better informed debate, and it's also responsibility of politicians, let's bring it back to Europe, who are now in office, to provide that information. It would help if the private sector was more engaged in saying, these jobs we predict we can create, these jobs we predict we'll lose. It is incredibly difficult, I can tell you from experience, to get companies to share that information. They see it as a trade secret, they see it as competitively sensitive, but we as politicians cannot do it alone. Politicians don't create globalization. It's a misconception, I think. The best we can do is adopt as well as we can the policies to the changing times. But we need more people to be a part of that discussion. And it's true what the other speaker said, that there's not enough sort of constructive, positive, forward-looking discussions about how that could be done.
Mauro, you wanted to add to this?
Just a quick point. I mean, I think it is objectively more difficult to answer legitimate concerns of people when you have exhausted the potential for rapid growth. But the potential for rapid growth comes most of the time from the fact that you've had none for a while. I was in a generation who was born in the middle of the economic boom. We grew up with the idea that Europe could have full employment, that things would be fantastic. We had a much better life than our parents, and we did. So do the Chinese today, and if I compare the mood in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, it reflects the fact that Eastern Europe is still catching up, and yes, there is dissatisfaction with the speed of that, but there is also a greater tension towards catching up, towards doing better, and there is perhaps a bit less fear than I see in Western Europe. But for policymakers, that should not be the point. The point should be, how do you address what people want? And the point I was trying to make earlier is that when you are poor and you're growing, that helps you hide the fact that you're doing the wrong policies. When you're no longer growing fast, you cannot hide the fact that in the past 20, 30 years, collectively, all policymaking in the world has produced a greater inequality, an inequality which have never been greater before. I'm not saying China's inequalities are smaller than Europe. They're probably bigger, but they're easier to hide. We can no longer hide the fact that we have inequality. And that is a fundamental problem, and people are prepared to accept that their situation is not going to improve as rapidly as they would like. What they're not going to accept is see their situation not improving and deteriorating, and somebody else next to them going up like this.
Or false and easy promises from politicians. We've seen so many promises, like 1,000 euros per family, in our country, or per person even, completely unrealistic. When you do that, you set yourself up for backlash, and I think that this is part of also being able to be honest towards people about what may come. I think in Estonia, very difficult reforms were executed, and the population just, put their head down and went through. And
Okay, good. So we have 10 minutes to go. We have a couple of more questions to ask, but let's keep the questions also short so more people can ask that. So, gentlemen in the first row.
Alan Riley, Atlantic Council. My question is actually on about China, really, and particularly in relation to President Macron. I think he is now president, no longer president-elect. I think he's now president. From President Macron, his call for dealing with Chinese abusive trade practices, potential for an EU foreign investment law, or an EU CFIUS perhaps, streamlining the anti-dumping rules, perhaps getting rid of the lesser duty rule, creating much more speedier and faster anti-dumping rules, and taking a much tougher line on lack of reciprocity of access into the Chinese market. And do you think this is something pushed by Macron, which will be something that the European Union is likely to take on board? And can you be able to consensus to develop that in the next few years? And will this be also a way of potentially attacking populist concern about globalization as well?
Siim?
No, I have heard during my being again in the Commission numerous times proposals to introduce protectionist measures against China and Bangladesh and various countries. But in this particular issue, sometimes it's difficult to realize that this decision can be done only by 27 countries together. Mm-hmm. And this was a proposal, again, this so-called lingerie war, where southern countries came and were very strong in introducing some kind of protectionist measures, but others said that this doesn't fly, and this was over. So I think that there will be, and France has always been active and looking for various measures, and you simply can say that, come on, you have more than 3% deficit, you have enormous subsidies to the economy, where is your growth, and why do you have still the unemployment? This doesn't depend on China. Mm-hmm. This depends on internal structural reforms. But this is so widespread proposals coming. Now, for instance, European Union now introduced in February, I suppose, custom tariffs to certain Chinese steel products. But I remember again, in earlier times, this was various times it was discussed, and then it was rejected. But now times obviously have changed a little. But still, this is exclusive competence of the European Union. And if now, and also President Trump has said that he wants to talk trade issues with Bundeskanzler Angela Merkel, again, this desire to have bilateral agreements, this is bad. And if we should, if somebody should decide the future steps or policies, this is clearly, and also for Americans, it's important. We can revisit the all structural, all global structures. WTO has been created. It's a huge structure which is promoting global free trade. And we can whatever think about how these structures, including the European Union, including others, NAFTAs, work better. But to abandon these structures, it can be disastrous.
Stefan and then Mauro.
I'm wary of the unified theory approach to solving issues with China. There are issues in different baskets of issues with China, and I think our politicians too often try to solve them with one solution, and oftentimes that solution is economic leverage. There are the economic and trade issues, and they're very compelling issues, and they should be addressed. There were human rights and democracy issues, which both Europe and the United States seem to have lost interest in largely with China over the last 10 to 15 years. There are foreign policy and national security issues related to the rise of China and the way it's asserting its power, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. And then there's just the fact that China's big. On the first issue, on the economic and the trade issues, I think it's very important that we take this dialogue on, but that we keep it focused on those issues and we operate on the premise of approaching China with incentives to be a full partner in a functioning and growing global economy. And we also have to recognize that many of the practices that China has are the same practices our countries had as we were developing our economies. My company faced equity caps in Italy, just like China imposes equity caps today. Over time, over the decades and over the century, these irritants are worked out and pushed out, and we have to work quickly with China to do that because China is the biggest stakeholder in the global trading system. On human rights and democracy, that'll be up for our governments to decide. On China's national security issues, I think that's a separate issue. And on being big, we can't wish China not to be big. The reason why a lot of these issues are outsized is because China is outsized. So I'm wary of the monolithic approach, and I think too often politicians see a cure-all. China should be incentivized to be able to invest in other countries as part of how it treats other countries to invest. Two things I'm wary about in particular are efforts to impose reciprocity, because that seems to me often to be a slogan for a race to the bottom, not a race to the top, and also the use of protectionist tools to get there. I think we can do more harm to ourselves than we can do to China if we take the wrong approach.
Look, I mean, the fact that populists use certain arguments doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong. If you look at China, look at the steel industry, look at Chinese overcapacity, we haven't spent 20 years, billions of euros, and lost thousands of jobs to restructure our steel industry, only to see China create an overcapacity which alone is bigger than our industry, without any visible outlet. At the same time, people are beginning to worry about technology flows, because today there isn't any Chinese technology we actually want to buy. But the reason why we can afford to have free flows of technology with the United States is because technology goes both ways. Because technology is there to be deployed. Either you sell it as such, you sell the company, you sell the product. With China, will we be able to do all this? So these are real concerns, and we will continue to react. At the same time, we should be under no illusion that whatever we can do to counter these practices actually solves the problem. Because the problem we have with China is much bigger than that. At one level, we need China. Just imagine if we didn't have cheap Chinese imports. Given the development of wages in the Western world, you would have had people howling in the street if we hadn't lowered the cost of living through cheap Chinese imports. We need China as a market. We need China as a partner. They're not a good market. They're not a good partner today. The other problem we have is that we labored for up to at least 15 years under the illusion, and when I mean we, I say mainly Europe and the United States, that China was going to become like us. It isn't.
Nope.
It doesn't want to. It has no intention whatsoever. It wishes to modernize, but not to reform. It wishes to become something as good as Western economies, but different. Can they do it? I haven't a clue. Certainly, this is not something which is particularly in our interest. We're not going to solve China's problem anytime soon. We have to manage it, and the Chinese have to help manage it. So we will continue to react to whenever the Chinese do something that harms us. But this is going to stay with us for a while.
Can I just add one point that Mauro reminds me of? We will immensely improve our capacity to do this if we approve TTIP.
Of course.
So, unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm very sorry for all the hands in the audience who wanted to ask questions. I would personally would like to go on for an hour at least, because the discussion really has been intriguing. So let's give a big round of applause to all the speakers.